Anthony Babington was just 24 years old when they ripped his body apart piece by piece in front of a cheering crowd. This young English nobleman didn't die because he committed murder or led armies against his country. He died because he wrote letters. Letters that would seal not only his own gruesome fate, but also doom Mary, Queen of Scots, to the executioner's block. Picture this: a handsome, wealthy young Catholic with everything to live for, willing to throw it all away for a conspiracy so dangerous that merely discussing it meant death. In 1586, plotting against Queen Elizabeth wasn't just treason, it was signing your own death warrant in the most brutal way imaginable. And Anthony Babington didn't just sign his name to treason. He orchestrated an entire conspiracy to murder the Protestant Queen and replace her with her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Here's what makes Babington's story so chilling. This wasn't some desperate peasant with nothing to lose. Anthony came from wealth and privilege. He owned vast estates, had connections at court, and could have lived comfortably as a loyal English nobleman. But instead, he chose to become the centerpiece of what historians call one of the most dangerous plots against Elizabeth's throne. A plot so inflammatory that when it unraveled, it would change the course of English history forever. The young conspirator believed he was destined for greatness, convinced he could single-handedly restore Catholic rule to England. What he actually did was hand Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, the perfect excuse to destroy Mary, Queen of Scots, once and for all. Because every letter Babington wrote, every meeting he held, every detail of his assassination plot was being carefully documented by Elizabeth's intelligence network. You might think you know how Tudor executions worked, but Anthony Babington's death was so savage that even the bloodthirsty crowds of 16th century London were horrified. We're talking about a punishment specifically designed to inflict maximum agony while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The sentence was hanging, drawing, and quartering, but what actually happened to Babington and his fellow conspirators was so brutal that Elizabeth herself ordered the executioner to show more mercy to the second group of plotters. This wasn't just about one young man's misguided loyalty to his faith. Babington's conspiracy represented everything Protestant England feared most: foreign Catholic powers working with domestic traitors to overthrow their queen and return the country to papal authority. His plot involved Spanish support, papal blessing, and detailed plans for Elizabeth's assassination that would make modern security services break into a cold sweat. But here's the truly devastating part: Anthony Babington never stood a chance. From the moment he first made contact with Mary, Queen of Scots, his fate was sealed. Elizabeth's spy network had infiltrated every level of the conspiracy, reading every encrypted message, tracking every meeting, and building an airtight case for treason, while Babington thought he was operating in complete secrecy. The young nobleman who dreamed of becoming a Catholic hero instead became a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of challenging Elizabeth's Protestant settlement. His gruesome execution would send shockwaves through Catholic England, proving once and for all that no one, regardless of their birth or wealth, was beyond the reach of Tudor justice. Anthony Babington's story is one of misguided faith, political naivety, and a death so horrific it haunted witnesses for years. This is how a privileged young nobleman's religious convictions led him to one of the most brutal executions in English history. Anthony Babington wasn't just planning to kill the Queen of England. He was orchestrating what would become one of the most audacious assassination plots in British history, complete with foreign invasion, systematic murder, and the coronation of a Catholic rival who'd been imprisoned for nearly 2 decades. Picture this: a 24-year-old nobleman so consumed with religious fervor that he genuinely believed God wanted him to butcher Elizabeth I in her own palace. Babington didn't stumble into treason. He methodically constructed it, piece by bloody piece. The conspiracy began in 1586 when Babington received what he thought was divine validation for his murderous ambitions. A Catholic priest named John Ballard had just returned from Paris with electrifying news. Philip II of Spain was ready to invade England, but only if English Catholics could guarantee Elizabeth's death first. Ballard didn't just suggest regime change. He offered Babington a starring role in royal assassination. But here's where it gets truly insane. Babington wasn't content with simply killing Elizabeth. His plot read like a medieval horror story. 6 specific conspirators would murder the Queen simultaneously, while Babington himself would rescue Mary, Queen of Scots, from her prison and place her on England's throne. We're talking about a coordinated attack that would decapitate the entire Protestant establishment in a single bloody stroke. The man orchestrating this carnage had convinced himself he was England's Catholic savior. Babington had been obsessed with Mary, Queen of Scots, since childhood. He'd actually served as her page when she was first imprisoned, developing what modern psychologists would recognize as a dangerous fixation on his captive queen. Mary, meanwhile, was fighting for her life from her prison cell. After 18 years of captivity, she faced a horrifying reality. Elizabeth's spies were closing in, and her only chance of survival lay in the hands of young Catholic fanatics willing to commit regicide. When Babington's letters reached her through a secret communication network hidden in beer barrels, Mary saw her last desperate gamble. The letters themselves reveal the chilling intimacy of their conspiracy. Babington wrote to Mary with the devotion of a religious zealot. "Myself, with 10 gentlemen and 100 of our followers, will undertake the delivery of your royal person from the hands of your enemies." He wasn't just promising rescue, he was pledging wholesale slaughter of anyone protecting Elizabeth. Mary's response sealed both their fates. Rather than rejecting the assassination plot, she embraced it, writing back with detailed suggestions about timing, logistics, and the systematic murder of Elizabeth's closest advisors. She even requested that foreign Catholic forces should land in England during the chaos to ensure Protestant resistance couldn't regroup. What makes this conspiracy particularly horrifying is how methodically they planned mass murder. Babington's group didn't just want Elizabeth dead. They created detailed lists of Protestant nobles who would need to be eliminated, mapped out which Catholic prisoners should be released to join their cause, and even planned the ceremonial details of Mary's coronation over Elizabeth's corpse. The correspondence between Babington and Mary reads like a handbook for religious terrorism. They discussed which churches would be seized first, how to coordinate with Spanish invasion forces, and the exact moment when Elizabeth's Protestant counselors should be assassinated to prevent any organized resistance. By summer 1586, Babington had assembled his death squad, secured foreign backing, and received written confirmation from Mary herself that she approved of Elizabeth's murder. What he didn't realize was that every letter, every secret meeting, and every whispered plan had been carefully monitored by the most sophisticated intelligence network in Europe. Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, had been reading their correspondence from the very beginning. Anthony Babington thought he was untouchable. Here was a young English nobleman, educated, charming, with connections stretching from the highest Catholic circles to foreign courts. He believed his encrypted correspondence with Mary, Queen of Scots, was completely secure. He was catastrophically wrong. What Babington didn't know was that every single letter he sent to Mary had been intercepted, decoded, and read by Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, before Mary ever laid eyes on it. For months, Walsingham had been running one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in European history, and Babington had walked straight into the trap. The fatal moment came in July 1586. Babington received what he believed was a secret letter from Mary, enthusiastically endorsing his assassination plot against Elizabeth. The letter seemed to give royal blessing to murder the Queen and promised Mary's full support. Babington was ecstatic. This was the green light he'd been waiting for. So he did exactly what Walsingham hoped he would do. He wrote back with every damning detail. In his reply, Babington laid out the entire conspiracy. 6 men would kill Elizabeth. He named names, described methods, outlined escape routes. He even included a detailed plan for Mary's rescue from captivity. It was a complete confession, written in his own hand, sealed with his own seal. The moment he sent that letter, Anthony Babington had signed his own death warrant. But here's where it gets truly devastating. Mary's enthusiastic letter encouraging assassination had been forged by Walsingham's agents. The real Mary had never seen the original conspiracy letter. Walsingham had intercepted it, added his own postscript asking for the names of the conspirators, then sent it on to Mary. When she replied with what she thought was harmless correspondence, Walsingham twisted her words to create the smoking gun he needed. The net closed with terrifying efficiency. On August 14, 1586, Babington was dining at a London tavern when government agents surrounded the building. Somehow, sensing danger, he managed to slip away, but his escape only delayed the inevitable. For 10 days, this pampered nobleman who'd spent his life in luxury halls and elegant courts found himself hiding in the forests around London, sleeping rough, disguising himself as a labourer. They found him in a barn near Harrow, his hands stained with walnut juice in a pathetic attempt to look like a common worker. The transformation was complete, from confident conspirator to desperate fugitive to captured traitor in barely 2 weeks. His co-conspirators fell like dominoes. John Ballard, the priest who'd originally approached Babington about the plot, was arrested trying to flee the country. The 6 men designated to kill Elizabeth were rounded up within days. Chidiock Tichborne, barely 24 years old, was caught at his family estate. Thomas Salisbury was dragged from a safe house in London. The evidence was overwhelming. Walsingham didn't just have their letters. He had their confessions under torture, witness testimony, and a paper trail stretching across Europe. These men hadn't just plotted against Elizabeth, they documented their every move in writing. The capture of the Babington conspirators sent shockwaves through Catholic England. If Walsingham could penetrate their most secret networks, decode their most sophisticated ciphers, and turn their most trusted communications against them, where could anyone hide? The message was clear. Elizabeth's government had eyes everywhere, and plotting against the Protestant regime wasn't just dangerous, it was suicide. Anthony Babington's fatal misstep wasn't just trusting the wrong people. It was underestimating the ruthless efficiency of a government fighting for its very survival. The trial of Anthony Babington wasn't really a trial at all. It was political theater with a predetermined ending. By September 1586, when 28-year-old Babington stood before his accusers, everyone in that courtroom already knew he was walking dead man. Here's what made this trial particularly brutal. Babington had no legal representation, no right to cross-examine witnesses, and no access to the evidence against him. The proceedings were conducted under rules that made conviction virtually automatic. You're looking at a legal system designed not to find truth, but to legitimize executions that had already been decided in the shadows of Elizabeth's court. The evidence against Babington was overwhelming, but here's where it gets truly damning. Much of it came from his own hand. Those intercepted letters we talked about earlier. They were read aloud in court, every treasonous word. Imagine sitting there, listening to your own handwriting seal your death warrant. Babington had written explicitly about assassinating the Queen, about foreign invasion, about armed rebellion. There was no denying authorship, no claiming the letters were forgeries. But wait, it gets worse. Walsingham's spy network had been so thorough that they presented testimony from multiple infiltrators who had witnessed Babington's meetings, recorded his conversations, and documented his every move for months. The prosecution didn't just have evidence, they had a complete dossier of treason that read like a step-by-step manual for overthrowing the government. The speed of the trial was breathtaking and terrifying. We're talking about proceedings that lasted mere days for a conspiracy that had taken months to unfold. No time for mounting a defense, no opportunity to challenge witnesses, no hope of legal maneuvering. This wasn't justice. It was administrative processing of predetermined death sentences. What made Babington's situation even more hopeless was the political climate surrounding the trial. This wasn't just about punishing conspirators, it was about sending a message that would echo across Catholic Europe. Elizabeth's government needed these executions to be public, brutal, and unforgettable. Babington and his fellow conspirators weren't just criminals. They were propaganda tools in England's religious war. The moment of sentencing revealed the true horror awaiting these men. They weren't just condemned to death. They were sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, the most savage punishment English law could inflict. The judge's words would have chilled the blood of everyone present. To be dragged to the place of execution, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded and cut into quarters. Medieval brutality designed to make examples out of men's agony. Babington's reaction to his sentence shows us the human cost of political ambition gone wrong. Contemporary accounts describe him as stunned into silence, the reality of his approaching death finally penetrating through months of conspiratorial fantasy. This was a young nobleman who had imagined himself a hero of Catholic restoration, now facing the most agonizing death the state could devise. The swift condemnation of Babington and his conspirators demonstrated Elizabeth's government at its most ruthlessly efficient. No appeals, no mercy pleas, no diplomatic interventions from foreign courts. Just the cold machinery of Tudor justice grinding toward its inevitable, bloody conclusion. Within days of their sentencing, these men would discover exactly how far Elizabeth was willing to go to protect her throne and her religious settlement. The trial's outcome was never in doubt, but its speed and severity sent shockwaves through Catholic communities across Europe, proving that plotting against Elizabeth Tudor carried consequences more terrible than death itself. September 20th, 1586. Anthony Babington stood in St. Giles Fields, London, knowing he was about to endure the most savage form of execution the English legal system could devise. Hanging, drawing, and quartering wasn't just a death sentence. It was theater of cruelty designed to destroy a person's body, soul, and memory in the most public way possible. Here's what this actually meant for Babington. First, he would be hanged by the neck, but not until death. The executioner would cut him down while he was still conscious, still breathing, still aware of everything happening to his body. Then came the disemboweling. His abdomen sliced open while he watched his own intestines pulled out and burned before his eyes. Only after this prolonged torture would he be beheaded and his body hacked into quarters. But wait, it gets worse. Queen Elizabeth herself had given specific instructions that Babington and his co-conspirators should be executed in such sort as their offense deserveth. Translation: make it as brutal as possible. The crowd that gathered wasn't just there to watch. They were part of the punishment. These executions were designed as public spectacles where commoners could witness what happened to anyone who dared threaten the crown. We're talking about thousands of people treating a man's torture like entertainment, vendors selling food and drink, families bringing children to watch. Contemporary accounts describe Babington's final moments in chilling detail. As he stood on the scaffold, this 25-year-old nobleman who had once danced at court maintained his composure. He spoke to the crowd, acknowledging his crimes but asking for prayers for his soul. Then the real horror began. The executioner placed the noose around Babington's neck. Unlike a standard hanging designed for quick death, this was calculated strangulation. Historical records suggest victims remained conscious for several minutes, their bodies convulsing as they slowly suffocated while the crowd watched every spasm. When Babington was cut down, still breathing, the disemboweling began immediately. Medical experts today believe the shock and blood loss would have created a dreamlike state, but witnesses reported he was clearly aware as his intestines were removed. The executioner held up each organ to the crowd before throwing it into the fire, prepared specifically for this purpose. The smell alone must have been overwhelming. Burned flesh, blood, and human waste creating a stench that clung to spectators' clothes for days. Yet the crowd stayed, many pushing forward for a better view. Here's the truly disturbing part. Elizabeth had initially ordered that all 14 conspirators receive this full treatment, but after watching Babington and 6 others endure this torture, even the bloodthirsty Tudor crowd began to turn queasy. Reports suggest people were fainting, vomiting, and crying out for mercy on behalf of the condemned men. The Queen, Hearing reports of the public reaction, quietly modified the sentences for the remaining 7 conspirators. They would be hanged until fully dead before the butchery began, a mercy that came too late for Babington. His quartered remains were displayed on spikes throughout London, his head placed on London Bridge, where it would remain for months, slowly decomposing as a warning to anyone else considering treason. Every merchant, every visitor to the city, every child crossing that bridge would see Anthony Babington's skull and know exactly what happened to those who threatened Elizabeth Tudor. This wasn't justice. It was psychological warfare waged through human flesh, and Anthony Babington became its most famous victim. Mary, Queen of Scots, had just signed her own death warrant with ink that wasn't even dry yet. The moment those encrypted letters were discovered in Babington's possession, Elizabeth's government finally had what they'd been hunting for over 18 years. Irrefutable proof that Mary was actively plotting the Queen's assassination from her prison cell. But here's where the political chess game gets truly brutal. Elizabeth's spy master, Francis Walsingham, hadn't just stumbled upon this conspiracy. He'd orchestrated the entire thing as an elaborate trap. For months, he'd been feeding Mary exactly what she wanted to hear through double agents, encouraging her to put her treasonous thoughts into writing. Every letter she sent, every instruction she gave, Walsingham's men were copying before it reached Babington. The Scottish Queen walked directly into a snare that had been years in the making. The political earthquake that followed Babington's capture sent shockwaves through every Catholic court in Europe. Philip II of Spain, who'd been secretly funding assassination attempts against Elizabeth for decades, suddenly found his intelligence networks completely exposed. The Babington conspirators had been in direct contact with Spanish agents, and their confessions under torture revealed the full scope of foreign interference in English affairs. We're talking about a 16th-century version of international espionage warfare, with England's survival hanging in the balance. Parliament's reaction was swift and merciless. Within weeks of Babington's execution, both houses were demanding Mary's immediate execution. But Elizabeth found herself trapped in an impossible political situation. Execute Mary, and she'd be killing an anointed queen, setting a precedent that could justify regicide anywhere in Europe. Every monarch on the continent would view Mary's execution as a direct threat to their own divine right to rule. But keep Mary alive, and she'd remain a permanent magnet for every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth's throne. The international fallout was exactly what Elizabeth feared. Pope Sixtus V immediately declared that whoever killed the heretic Elizabeth would be performing a holy act blessed by God himself. Philip II started openly preparing his massive invasion fleet, what would become the Spanish Armada. The Babington Plot had essentially declared open season on Elizabeth's life, turning her from a political rival into a religious enemy who needed to be destroyed at all costs. Here's what makes this even more insane. The plot's discovery actually strengthened Elizabeth's position domestically, while making her infinitely more vulnerable internationally. English Catholics who might have supported Mary's claim to the throne suddenly found themselves viewed as potential traitors. Anyone with Catholic sympathies faced immediate suspicion. The paranoia was so intense that even having a priest in your household became grounds for investigation. But the most devastating political consequence was what happened to Mary herself. For nearly 2 decades, she'd been Elizabeth's prisoner, but still maintained her dignity as a legitimate queen. The Babington letters stripped away that protection completely. She was no longer a fellow monarch who'd been temporarily detained. She was a convicted traitor who'd actively tried to murder her captor. Elizabeth delayed Mary's execution for months, desperately hoping for some political solution that wouldn't require her to cross that terrible line. But Parliament, her advisers, and the English people were unanimous. Mary, Queen of Scots, had to die. The woman who'd once been considered the most beautiful queen in Europe would face the executioner's axe because a young English nobleman had been foolish enough to put their treasonous correspondence in writing. The Babington Plot had accomplished something that 18 years of house arrest couldn't. It had finally made Mary's execution not just politically necessary, but politically inevitable. Anthony Babington's brutal death didn't just end one young man's life. It shattered an entire generation of Catholic hope and reshaped the religious landscape of England forever. The aftermath of his execution rippled through history in ways that would have horrified even his executioners. Here's what textbooks won't tell you about the real impact. Babington's conspiracy didn't just fail spectacularly. It became the justification for a religious purge that lasted decades. Elizabeth's government used his plot as evidence that every Catholic in England was a potential assassin, a traitor waiting to strike. Suddenly, practicing your faith became synonymous with treason, and the paranoia that followed made the already dangerous life of English Catholics absolutely unbearable. But the personal cost was even more devastating. Babington was just 25 when he died, younger than most people today when they finish college. This wasn't some hardened revolutionary or experienced conspirator. Court records show he came from a respected family, received an excellent education, and genuinely believed he was serving God and justice. His letters reveal a man who saw himself as a romantic hero, not realizing he was walking into a trap that would cost him everything. The tragedy deepens when you consider his fellow conspirators. These weren't career criminals or foreign agents. They were young English gentlemen, educated and idealistic, who genuinely believed they were fighting religious oppression. The average age of the executed conspirators was just 27. We're talking about an entire circle of friends who died the most agonizing death imaginable because they fell for what was essentially a government sting operation. Mary, Queen of Scots, paid the ultimate price for Babington's amateur plotting. Her execution in 1587, directly caused by the letters linking her to his conspiracy, eliminated the last legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne. Elizabeth had spent nearly 2 decades avoiding Mary's execution, knowing it would outrage Catholic Europe and potentially justify foreign invasion. Babington's letters gave her the legal cover she desperately needed. The broader historical impact reveals something even more chilling about Tudor politics. Babington's conspiracy wasn't just discovered, it was orchestrated and prolonged by Francis Walsingham's spy network. Government agents didn't just intercept the plot, they actively encouraged it, allowing it to develop until they had enough evidence to justify the most brutal punishments imaginable. This wasn't justice, it was political theater written in blood. The religious consequences lasted generations. Catholic families across England watched young Anthony Babington's horrific execution and understood the message perfectly. Your faith makes you a target. Your loyalty will always be questioned, and one mistake could cost you everything. The psychological impact of state-sponsored religious terror shaped English Catholic identity for centuries. Modern historians recognize Babington's story as a perfect example of how religious extremism on both sides destroyed lives and families. His execution demonstrated that Elizabeth's government, despite its reputation for religious tolerance, was willing to use the most savage methods to eliminate threats, real or manufactured. The most haunting aspect of Babington's legacy isn't his failed conspiracy. It's how completely his story validates every fear Catholics had about Elizabethan England. He died believing he was a martyr for his faith, but history remembers him as a naive young man, manipulated by government agents and destroyed by forces he never understood. His brutal execution became both warning and prophecy. In Tudor England, religious conviction and political loyalty were luxuries that could cost you everything, including your life. Anthony Babington's brutal death didn't just end one young man's life. It rewrote the entire future of England. His severed head, displayed on London Bridge for months, became a silent warning that would echo through centuries of English politics. Every ambitious nobleman who passed beneath it understood the message: challenge the crown, and this is how you die. But here's what makes Babington's legacy truly chilling. His execution didn't just punish treason, it perfected the art of political terror. Elizabeth I and her spy master Francis Walsingham had orchestrated something far more sophisticated than simple justice. They'd created a public spectacle so horrifying that it would haunt the English consciousness for generations. The screams from Babington's torture weren't just punishment for his conspiracy, they were a masterclass in state-sponsored intimidation. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating. Within months of Babington's execution, Mary, Queen of Scots, followed him to the scaffold, her fate sealed by the very letters the conspiracy had generated. The Catholic cause in England didn't just suffer a setback, it was systematically dismantled. Recusant families who had harbored secret hopes of restoration watched their dreams die with Babington's last breath. The price of religious resistance had been written in blood so vividly that few dared to pay it. What's truly remarkable is how Babington's death transformed English intelligence gathering. Walsingham's network, which had so expertly manipulated the young nobleman, became the blueprint for centuries of state surveillance. The methods used to entrap Babington, intercepted letters, turned agents, elaborate deceptions, established techniques that would be refined and employed by English intelligence services into the modern era. His conspiracy didn't just fail, it inadvertently created the world's first modern spy network. The execution itself set a precedent that would define English justice for centuries. The calculated brutality wasn't accidental, it was policy. Future conspirators would face the same methodical destruction, their deaths choreographed to maximize both suffering and political impact. The Gunpowder Plot, conspirators, the Jacobite rebels, even the Cato Street conspirators would all meet their ends following the template established by Babington's execution. His death became the gold standard for state vengeance. But perhaps Babington's most lasting legacy lies in what he represented, the death of romantic notions about political resistance. Before his conspiracy, ambitious young nobles could imagine themselves as heroic figures in grand historical dramas. After watching Babington's intestines torn from his living body, such romantic delusions became impossible to maintain. Political opposition in England became more calculated, more cautious, and infinitely more subtle. The psychological impact on English society was profound. Babington's execution marked the moment when Elizabeth's England fully embraced the principle that state security trumped individual conscience. The message was clear. Personal beliefs, no matter how sincere, would not be permitted to challenge royal authority. This wasn't just about Catholic versus Protestant, it was about establishing the supremacy of political power over religious conviction. Even today, Anthony Babington's story serves as a case study in the dangers of political fanaticism and the brutal efficiency of authoritarian response. His tale reminds us that in the game of political power, good intentions mean nothing if you lack the means to achieve them, and that states, when threatened, will employ whatever means necessary to preserve themselves. The young man who dreamed of rescuing a queen and restoring his faith became instead a cautionary tale about the price of challenging absolute power. His legacy lives on, not in the Catholic restoration he died for, but in the methods his enemies used to destroy